Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, Reading at the Edge of a Thousand Worlds, Bad Indians Book Club from Patty Krawec is out through Goose Lane Editions. She joins me on the program to discuss it. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So, is this like an offshoot of the podcast, or like, how do you conceive of this book coming out of an actual like book club that you did in discussion with panelists and friends and fellow readers?
Yeah, so I mean, it was part of this project, right? I think we all had our COVID projects, and bringing together readers and the authors they read to talk about Indigenous literatures, and why they matter. Why should we read these things about what Native Indigenous people think about all kinds of different stuff, right? Because we do science, we write history, and we have thoughts about gender and all of that stuff, fiction, science fiction. So that was a really fun project. A lot of really neat observations or ideas happened in those conversations, because that's why we have book clubs, right? That's why we don't just read things by ourselves all the time, because we want to talk to other people about them and kind of get a new perspective. And it just felt like it was just kind of languishing there out in the universe. And I wanted to kind of pull the ideas together and then also expand them, because the podcast, which originally aired as Ambe, A Year of Indigenous Reading, and not all the episodes, they all streamed live to Twitch, but they didn't all come out in podcast format. They've been re-edited and remastered. Dr. Eve Tuck's Visiting Lab at Lenapehoking with Tiffany Hill have done that work for me, which is really, really kind of them. So they're back out now as Bad Indians Book Club. And they themselves were an expansion of some of the things I was thinking when I wrote Becoming Kin. And then the podcasts, the conversations themselves expanded, particularly after the second conversation, where Taya Miles pointed out the gaps, right? The gaps in Black studies where Native people should be, the gaps in Native studies where Black people should be. And so it just started expanding into, okay, so we can't just focus on Indigenous literatures, even though, Black people, African people were Indigenous in their own right. It was Indigenous people that were taken from Africa and relocated here. We also had to think about all kinds of other marginalized people. Well, how do Palestinians, what about Palestinian writing? What about Jewish writing? What about, Latin writing? What about all these other people? And how do I just keep expanding and expanding all of these people who are all shoved into the margins? We're all shoved into the margins. So why aren't we looking at each other? Why do we keep looking at this house that's on fire, as James Baldwin puts it, and keep trying to DEI ourselves into it? Like, that's silly. So it emerged from the podcast conversations, I think would be the best way to put it. I do quote the conversations quite often, and the back of the book actually has a listing of all of the people who participated and the books that were recommended. But it's an expansion of those conversations is probably the best way to think about it.
Well, even with something as an expansion, as you write in, the acknowledgments at the end, like at a certain point you had to hand the book in, and you kept wanting to like add books or be like, oh, I should include this. And how do you find, is it just simply like there's a deadline and I can't go past this point in terms of integrating or like synthesizing new books or things that I've come across? Like, how do you kind of figure out what an endpoint is for something like this? Or do you start bookmarking things for like Bad Indians Book Club Part 2? Or like, how do you kind of come about?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is deadline, right? Because when you pitch a book and they give you a contract, they need it by this day. And although it can be a little bit loose, it can't be a lot loose. But then there's also the number of words that they want. They want a certain number of words. And I'm like 10,000 words over what they ask for. But that was okay. There's also a little bit of flexibility. So some of it is that. Some of it is also at some point you have to let the bird fly, right? It's not a blog, which lives kind of like, I've got thousandworlds.ca, which is my blog. And that kind of you just keep adding to it and maybe updating old blog posts as you come across new information. A book is really, and this was something that my friend Alexis Shotwell helped me understand, is just kind of a snapshot in time. And so I tried to hold on to that even as at some points I kind of, expanded into other things. Like, there's topics I don't talk about. I don't talk about geography, which is really mortifying to me, because I did have a conversation on another podcast, Medicine for the Resistance, that I did with my friend Carrie, where we did talk about Indigenous geographies. And so some of that expansion I'm trying to do in my book promotion work. So, like you do the different launch events and the different, appearances and stuff. And so I'm trying to draw in authors' conversations that maybe I didn't explore as much as I would have liked to in the book, do that in the promotional stuff. So when I'll be in Vancouver and beginning of October, and I'm talking with an Indigenous geographer at that event so that we can kind of fully explore that more fully. So it's a snapshot in time, but then the afterlife of it, the conversations I have, allows me to kind of expand on stuff that I wasn't able to expand on in the book. And I mean, there's no end of books, right? Like that could be an encyclopedia.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say, you had to kind of like shed a few things topic wise to fit the book. And initially in reading it, I thought, oh, we're going to kind of go through like what you did in the book club and then like month by month. But at a certain point, that stops being the case, right? That it's not just itemizing, these are the conversations we had and here's me expanding on the books that we talked about. And I'm curious about the decision making that went into like kind of what stayed on air in the sense of like the podcasts and then what fit in the page and how you made those kind of decisions.
Oof. Well, some of them I collapsed. Like we had two topics. There was one about surrounded by relatives that we did in April, which was kind of springtime for me, not springtime for everybody who was participating, but it was springtime for me. And then there was the food sovereignty episode later. And to me, those two seemed to overlap. And so I collapsed them into a single chapter. But we only had really two conversations about fiction. And so those I expanded, and we didn't even really talk about, specifically about horror or futurisms. We touched on them a little bit, but we didn't really expand on them. And so so I really expanded those chapters so that I could think more fully about how we write about these things, all of, those of us at the margins. And those chapters were a lot of, I would say, fun to write, I guess, because those were things where I was really learning a lot as I was writing, because we hadn't had those conversations. So it wasn't something that I was able to kind of pull out of my head. And so that's probably where you're kind of seeing the shift, where it's not so much about the conversation itself. And that's because I had to include that stuff. We write fiction, we write horror, we write science fiction. I didn't even get into romance novels, which is a whole other thing, because we write those too.
Sure enough. Yeah, no, I did see that shift. The other shift I noticed, so there's a story of Kwe, the deer lady, that's woven through kind of like preceding each kind of academic chapter, let's say. There's this like fictionalized story. Yeah. And at a certain point, it changes it's no longer in the third person. Like it's told, Dear Lady becomes like the protagonist in the, like we're in interior to Dear Lady at a certain point. And I was curious about kind of like, was that supposed to mirror kind of like where things were at with you and reading, or like how you came about kind of landing on that transition?
Well, there were a few things that played into that. Wow, you ask really good questions. So in memoir, because memoir is where we find out that she's been talking about herself. We find out that this whole time that we've been reading her story with this kind of omniscient narrator, when we get to memoir, we realize that she has been sitting in this sweat lodge telling her story to the young woman who runs the sweat lodge. And she'd been talking about herself in the third person. And that comes from an X-Files episode where Scully is dealing with all this trauma and she's referring to herself in the third person. And the therapist says the line that the young woman in the sweat lodge says, where she says, "Do you realize you've been talking about yourself in the third person?" And Scully's like, "Oh, I have?" Because that's a way of distancing ourselves from trauma. We talk about it as if it happened to somebody else. And so then at the end of that little piece of fiction, she starts over again using first person. And then there's another one where I tell it in second person. And that actually came from a short story that Rebecca Roanhorse wrote about your personalized Indian adventure or something like that. I forget. It's one of those futuristic VR things where people get to pretend to be Indians. And that's told in the second person. You're doing this, you're doing that. And it has an interesting way of putting the reader into the story. So now you, the reader, get to experience Dear Woman's presence, because you work in this coffee shop and you've been under threat, and now you see this woman, and then then it shifts into first person. because then Dear Woman resumes telling her own story, but now she owns the story. She admits this is her. And the last one actually starts with, yeah, that was all me. That was me.
Are these like the secret handshakes or, drop threads that you refer to, that like when you talk about, letting people in, but maybe signaling to those who know a little more that you're kind of like the fallen feathers, and that like if you've read Tanya Talaga, you'll know that that's what you're referring to, and these kinds of things where like it's peppered in based on kind of like a shared knowledge or that secret handshake?
Sometimes, I mean, fiction does that all the time, right? And you hear it like, pop culture references will make, you make a quick pop culture reference and people will know what you're talking about because if they haven't seen the show, they've heard of the show, and so we understand pop culture references. It's a little trickier when you're doing that with Indigenous storytelling because our cultural references aren't as broadly known. And so those almost become little Easter eggs, for people who are in the know to find. And one kind of really silly example of it is when the central character in the story of the young woman who's the waitress in Thunder Bay, she talks about the container ships that says that she misread them as Happy Lloyd. And my editor asked me if I wanted to explain that. And I was like, no, I don't, because someday somebody will be driving down the highway and they'll see that Hapag Lloyd, Hapag Lloyd container on the back of a truck. And they'll be like, oh, there's Happy Lloyd.
It's funny. I go past trains on the way home, and I've seen the Hapag Lloyd containers on the back of a train before. So
yeah, I was on vacation somewhere, and I saw it, and I thought it said Happy Lloyd, and now in my head it's all there. Those are always Happy Lloyd, and so that's what I kind of hope is that people who read the book will see that container and be like, hey, there's Happy Lloyd. But I mean, there's other things like the fallen feather. If you've read Tanya's book, you would know the whole big thing that's gesturing towards. But that's what pop cultural references do in film, in TV, in the books that we read. They tell a whole story in a single phrase. We know what it means. I don't know if you're a Star Trek fan, but there's like a whole Star Trek episode about that.
I've watched some Star Trek. I was kind of a TNG kid.
Yeah, it was The Next Generation.
Okay,
it's the one where he's Darmok and Jalad at Talagra. It's that episode.
Gotcha. There's no like easy way to transition to this, but I do want to ask, what silly question did Kyle ask? In the epigraph, you dedicate this to Carrie, who obviously is your co-host on the Medicine for the Resistance. But what was the silly question?
Kyle was the one who asked me for a recommendation of one or two books that would help them understand Indigenous thought.
Ah, okay.
So that was the silly question that really spawned a Twitter thread and a panel discussion, and now the book, and all they're going to get for their, for inspiring all this is a signed copy of the book. So it's not even that great a prize, but thank you.
Well, and a reading list. They got a reading list out of it.
They did. They got a reading list.
What kind of reader are you? Like, do you read purposefully, like, or like with like curiosity? Like, are you specifically reading to learn something or to explore something, or do you kind of walk blindly into some books at all? Like, how do you kind of approach reading?
I've always been a fairly intentional reader. I shouldn't say that. I used to read a lot of Victoria Holt and like Gothic novels and stuff like that. But I've always been very curious, and I love to read. My mom, as you can tell from the letter at the back of the book, taught me to love reading. And I would say that most of my reading is very intentional, and I'm trying to understand something that I didn't, about a community that I don't really know too much about, or just some political ideas that I don't. I've read so many books about neoliberalism lately because I have no idea what it is, and that was really helpful to do that reading. But I have to remind myself to read fiction. I always feel like there's so much to know. There's just not enough time to read all the things that I need to read in order to understand the world and my place in it, that I feel like I don't have time to read fiction, which is just such a terrible way to think, because I have gotten some really, really good insights from reading fiction. I know R.F. Kuang is all over everything right now. But I've gotten some really good insights on colonialism from her books. Some really good ways to understand it and conceptualize it, or just articulate it in a way that, oh, okay, that makes sense. Sometimes the penny drops. So I have to remind myself to read fiction and to go into those stories with that same kind of, this is going to help me understand the world, and poetry too. That's something I'm not really good at reading, but I am moderating a discussion about poetry in a few weeks, so I'm going to have to get better at that.
It's interesting to say you don't read fiction, and then to like close the book with the horror and the science fiction chapters. That like, it's not to say that like closing with it lends it more credence, but like that it emphasizes that imagined stories or the way that we tell things through fiction is as important as a lot of the like academic or nonfiction books that you cite prior to that, right? That like you close with that because it's a vision of the future, and even the notion that we're looking back at the past in order to envision the future is very important and central to like Indigenous notions of like the 7 generations, that it's all tied together, and everyone's story is fiction in some sense, right? Even memoir weaves in kind of what we want our audience to hear about us.
Yeah, and even history. That history is just stories we tell about the past, right? Science writing is stories we're telling about science. It's all storytelling. And and I think I wanted to emphasize those chapters and kind of split them up into 3 specific genres. One, those are the genres that really interest me, right? I like kind of your basic drama, your basic literature. I like horror. Horror is where I actually talk a lot about movies as well, because that's most of my experience with horror is film, but that's also a valid form of storytelling. And then futurisms and science fiction. And part of that is recognizing gaps in my own reading and thinking. Is I have to do this. This is also valid and important storytelling. My blog right now, I'm going through traditional Ojibwe stories, which are arguably fiction. They're made up. They're stories that were made up for a purpose. I don't know if Nana Bujout like actually literally walked the world. I don't know if these things like literally happened, but they're important stories about how to live well as an Anishinaabe person. So I'm taking them seriously, and I think that's why I wanted to focus on 3 genres of fiction, because those stories deserve to be taken seriously as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You introduced a concept that I don't know how to pronounce, so I'm just going to ask you for the pronunciation, but Mashkeeg?
Yeah, Mushkiki. Yeah, Mashkeeg, the swamp.
I'm wondering if maybe we can talk a little bit about that. And, is this something that you read about or like that you conceived of, like the development of this notion of like the people being kind of immersed in this ecosystem or this like space that's considered dirty, or in some ways kind of like a mixture of different elements, and how you arrived at that and how you kind of conceived of it within the book.
Yeah, well, I have a swampland behind my house, and I don't go there as often as I should. It's populated with coyotes, which makes me a little bit nervous to go back there. But yeah, it's also populated with ticks, which I'm not really wild about. But I do have it in behind my house, so I kind of look out back and I see it all the time. But also, Tiffany Lathobo King writes about ecotones in her book, The Black Shoals. And ecotones are places that are neither this nor that, right? So like Western world loves to think about binaries, right? Day, night, land, water. And the fact is we live so much of our life, geographically speaking, in ecotones, that are near shorelines or swamps or, all these different places. And these places are teeming with life, right? There's all kinds of life in there, and life emerging out of there, and, mushrooms and all of that wonderful stuff. Like the trees fall down and they become other things. And it's just such a great way to imagine how our communities could be. And even when you think about like, Black people escaping slavery, they went to the swamps because nobody wanted to go there. It's dangerous to be there. And there were Native people also hiding in the swamps, and they formed real communities of mutual aid and supported each other there. And swamps, you have to walk carefully in swamps. It's easy to twist an ankle or wind up to your knee because you thought it was solid ground and it turned out not to be. And that's also a good way of thinking about how to be gentle with each other as our communities are starting to look towards each other instead of, looking towards the culture that rejected us in the first place. So, we have to be gentle with each other. We have to tread carefully. There are times where we have caused harm and we need to work with that. But they're just such tremendous places of growth. My son I mentioned him a few times in the book, Ben, he was on 2 of the panels. he loves swamps. He loves the mushkeg. And I think there's a reason that mushkeg and mushkiki, I don't know, he doesn't he's not convinced enough that the words are actually related, but they might be. And there's medicine out there, and there's medicine among us if we apply that as a metaphor for how we're going to build relationships outside of, kind of the gentrified, paved over society.
Speaking of being gentle with each other, you have Omar El-Kad writes the foreword for this book, and he's in some sense a protagonist within the book because you talk about American War and calling him out for like where are the Indigenous people in American War, and his response is like it seems like there's like a gentleness to the reaction and to then a conversation that you have through his next book that he does consider this, and then you examine that book, and I was curious about kind of like, was it a natural thing to then ask him to write the foreword for this book because of that kind of like way that this happened between the two of you?
Yeah, so I didn't know him at the time. Like at first, when I tweeted out that this was about the saddest book I'd ever read, but where are the Indians? Because we exist in the American South. So where were we? And I had just had this conversation with Daniel Heath Justice on one of the podcasts, and he was always, and that's what he was talking about. He was, where are we? Where are we? And we're talking about futurisms, and it was like, where are we in the future? We're mostly not there. So what's going on? And when he said that, that started me looking for Native people in the books that I was reading. Where are we? Do we exist in this fiction? Are we even gestured towards? And so I sent this tweet out. I'm glad it wasn't as snarky as I can be sometimes. And I didn't really expect a response, but he gave like this beautiful, thoughtful response that then made me want to talk to him. And so we had this great conversation about his subsequent book, What Strange Paradise. And then now he's got this new book out. And one day everyone will have always been against this. And actually, it was that book that made me want to write the foreword, made me ask him to write the foreword. Because when you're publishing a book, your editor is like, now you have to, call everybody and ask them to write you an endorsement for the book. And that's just such a cringy thing to have to do, but you have to do it. And you think about, well, who do I know that I could ask? And so you do that. So you go through and you ask all of these people. And he warned me that this book was coming out, that everything, one day everyone will have always been against this was coming out. He warned me. He said that he really wasn't going to be doing a lot of blurbs or anything right now because he didn't want, if there was fallout from that book, from the position that he was taking on Palestine, he didn't want that to land on other people. And I said, okay, that's fair. Would you like to write the foreword? Because I kind of took it as a way of being in solidarity with him, that if you're going to come for him, you better come for me too, because the position he has is valid and righteous. So to me, it was a kind of an act of solidarity. Like, I don't know that he needed it. The book has actually been very, very well received, and he's a much bigger deal than I am. So I don't know that my solidarity meant had any kind of material benefit to him at all. But he did write that beautiful foreword. And we have had some really good conversations about writing. And he is just so thoughtful and kind. And I would really like to be a lot more like him.
Well, thoughtful conversations obviously are the root of this, right? That this book comes as a result of those thoughtful conversations you had on the podcast. And it seems to be like you quote from those conversations, and it seems to be that you want to spur thoughtful conversations as a result of this book. You mentioned Daniel Heath Justice talking about like, where are we within the, the books, like the sci-fi books and stuff. You also quote him as saying, why does reading specifically Indigenous material matter? It matters because we matter, right? Like that ultimately, like that's the crux of it, right? That this is you may have been pushed to the marsh or to the liminal spaces, but that doesn't mean that you don't exist, and that this is important to have these conversations about. What's your biggest hope for this book? Like, are you hoping people start like a Bad Indians book club? Like, is there kind of like?
I would love to see. I would love to see them cropping up everywhere where people were. we're willing to challenge ourselves with hard conversations because some of those conversations were about things that I didn't know anything about. And I'm thinking particularly about the conversation around refusing patriarchy and gender because I'm a cis heterosexual woman who's been married to the same man for 40 years. What do I know about queer life? Absolutely nothing. But I have to have these conversations. We have to be in community with each other. And it can be hard because I don't know if I'm going to step wrong, if I'm going to make a mistake, if I'm going to cause more harm. I grew up as an evangelical Christian. I held very harmful and destructive beliefs about that community. And so I hope that these conversations, if people, if they download Bad Indians Book Club podcast, that they hear those conversations and learn how to have them amongst themselves, how to pull things together and manage pushback. There are times, like throughout my 5 years of podcasting with Carrie, that we would push back on each other or that guests would push back on something that we had said. I often say people heard us learning in real time. I think we're so disconnected. Social media is wonderful. I love it. Used intentionally, it can also be like a terrible hellscape, but I like it if it's used well, and I try to curate my feeds so that they don't annoy me more than necessary. But they're also kind of isolating because we're not engaging with people. We're kind of sharing some ideas and then we're moving on. We're not really invested in the people that we're having conversations with. Whereas in person, we can do that. And our world doesn't have a lot of what you call third spaces, right? Like we're either at work, we're at home, we're at our faith community. We don't often know our neighbors. We're not hanging out with people who are different generations. I mean, my son plays flute and fiddle out in Halifax, and that is a wonderful mechanism, cultural mechanism for people to gather across generations and across different political spectrums to just get together and make music together. But there's not a lot of that out there, and book clubs have always been a great place to do that because they draw together different people who are interested in similar things. And so I would love to see, I mean, here in Niagara, we've started what we're calling the Niagara Movement School, which is to bring people together to read intentionally, to build a movement towards a more just Canada. So we're pulling together organizers and just people who are interested. And that's kind of at the far end of the political education spectrum. But there's also like wine moms who get together to drink wine and talk about the books that they didn't actually read. But that's valid too, because they're still hanging out. They're talking about why they picked up that particular title or that author. And there's a whole spectrum of ways that we can gather and talk and learn. But I want people to do it intentionally. And I would like people to do it radically, which just means to get at the root of it. That's all radical. We're scared of the word radical because we think it means one thing. All it means is to get at the root of something. And that means conversations. That means conversations with people that you may or may not agree with. It means being curious and listening to what's being said instead of just reacting to how what they said made you feel. But it's also talking about those feelings too. And that's the part that I'm not very good at.
Well, I want to thank you for this conversation, Patty, and for writing the book, Bad Indians Book Club, out through Goose Lane Editions. Now, thanks again for joining me on the program.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, you asked some really wonderful questions, made me think.
Oh, I appreciate that.